Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 10th episode of the Lockdown Conversations. I am Pratik Gandhi. With me is Yogesh. And Lockdown Conversations has been a place where we bring like the best of the minds together to discuss on key fundamentals of different topics that matter the most. This place we believe is to unite and inspire. And today we've got two amazing individuals from the startup VC world who have been moving fast and breaking things in their own ways. And it's our privilege to have both of them. Starting with Sasha, who leads business development at Near Protocol, based in San Francisco. He's done like a bunch of things in his previous roles as well. So welcome to the show, Sasha.
Hello.
Yeah.
Glad to see you.
Yeah, likewise. And on the other side of the spectrum, on the VC side, should I say, we've got Joel John, who's joining us from Bangalore. Joel has tons of experience on the analyst research side of things. He's one of the top analysts in the crypto space and has a VC background, has launched a lot of startups on his own. So yeah, Joel, thanks for being on the show. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
Yep. So yeah, I mean, I'd like to understand personal stories to kick off. And Sasha, maybe if you can dive us into how your startup journey has been, like what all you've done, what are you doing currently, and so on. So.
So look, I was interested in Silicon Valley startups ever since I came to US a little bit over 10 years ago. So kind of just met a whole bunch of people who were involved in it, was reading up on history of it, went to college, and then was interested in working in technology finance. But I realized that I really liked the technology side of it. So we were essentially selling technology companies to others. So we would sell Motorola to Google, we would sell Tumblr to Yahoo, really kind of interesting things there. But I realized for myself that I like the technology aspect of it a lot more than I like the finance aspect of it at the time. And so I actually left and started my own company and blew through all of my finance savings while doing this. So it was really rough, I would say. And so I blew through all of the savings and found myself kind of just living on a couch of a bunch of friends, trying to figure out what to do next. And then I went to work in technology companies after this, and was spending most of the time doing sales, business development in companies, starting with MuleSoft. And MuleSoft was a kind of pre-IPO company when I joined. It was integration software company. I worked there for a year and realized that I wanted to go to 10 times smaller company, knowing that it will be less stable, but it will provide upside in learning. And that's where I joined a database company called MemSQL. That was a small startup at the time. And so I worked there for two and a half years or so. And that's where I met some of the people from Near, actually. And so then later on, I jumped on board when essentially there was a particular point in time when a whole bunch of people joined. So yeah, that was my journey up to this point. And Near was the smallest one outside of my own company, but the real one, unlike my own company. So it was very rewarding experience so far.
Awesome. Great. Thanks for sharing that, Sasha. Joel, do you want to run us through? Yeah, sorry.
So I think a brief summary is that I entered the crypto space in 2012. I was running a small gaming community at the time, and PayPal had locked down my account. And the direct alternative for me, because I was under 18, was Bitcoin. And that's how I discovered the whole thing. I was in the Middle East, and I thought, why not try and create a low-cost remittance network on Bitcoin? Because back then, Western Union and Forex used to take about 15% of income of those who were earning anywhere up to let's say $200 to $300 a month. So the idea was to try and do that, but I was quite young. I was still in high school, and the technology was just not there yet. So what happened as a result of working on that was I got my first internship in VC as a result of that with what is now GSF Accelerator. It's one of the largest in India. I happened to come to India for a couple months and learn from entrepreneurs and VCs back then. Uh, I came back from the Middle East in 2014 to do my undergrad. That's the year the RBI issued its first notice on cryptocurrencies. So I thought, why not try and raise academic awareness around crypto? So in 2014, late 2014, I wrote a paper on banking on Bitcoin, and it actually refers to the entirety of the DeFi stack that is there now. That is your lending and your storage of value and that whole stuff. But the problem again was that I was working on something cutting edge remotely in India, so there was always a barrier of trust to cross. So I was always juggling what you would call a traditional startup and internships and VCs, just so that I could stay up to date in terms of skills. So I worked with Three Bright Partners in 2016 for a couple of months as an intern again. Fresh out of university, I was looking for something in research with blockchain. So that was my key focus. I didn't want to do a startup fresh out of university because I thought it's maybe apt to just go and get some actual experience from people in the world. So maybe that's, yeah, I think it had helped me over the last 3 years. So I worked with Traction, which is a Crunch-based competitor, for about a month. The problem was that I was doing a lot of research, but I couldn't claim ownership of it. So I just quit it after a month. I was fortunate enough to be recruited into Outlier Ventures as an intern back then. And I've been with them for about the last 3 years. I've also been involved with a number of venture investments in India, Nuo and Mudrex, through what's called Encrypt. And so it's been a mix of trying to build things a little ahead of the market and failing phenomenally at it, and learning from it, and also learning from some really great people in the industry over the last few years.
Awesome. Yeah.
Sure. Just as you say that, coming to the current situation, right? How is this entire ecosystem coping up with what's happening around us at the moment? I'm sure nobody had seen this coming. So how are you all responding to that?
So I think I had actually done a little bit of research on the venture side a few weeks back, and that is to look at what the trends are, right? So from a venture angle, this is what's happening, right? Fewer investments are happening with larger checks because investors want to make sure that any investment made has about 18 to 24 months of runway. So that's how venture investors are seeing it. So if you look at the average Series A, the average seed deal that's happening now versus, like, let's say before the virus took off, you will see they have increased larger in size. The flip side of this is many teams are really unable to close an early stage funding round anymore without substantial traction or IP or a story behind them, unlike earlier. So you will see way more mortality in the industry, but you're also seeing strength accruing to a number of people, right? So it's the natural cycle of all markets, except that in this case it's a little accelerated because of the pandemic going on. The other element that's not really mentioned is, I think, the mental health aspect of the industry right now, right? So I can tell you that as VCs, there's just the check element, but there's, like, when you speak to 20, 30 founders, they're all dealing with personal challenges with family. People are working from home for the first time. So it's a different industry altogether. I think a lot of people that come out strong on this would have, there's a great element of luck at play in the market right now. It's not just skill. Because, hey, if you're under 25 and you don't have anyone to take care of, you have that much of an edge versus someone that's in their mid-30s and has to take care of their parents and kids and all that going on, right? So there is that slight element of luck, I would say, right now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, and on the startups front, I think, Sasha, you've been following the trends as well in terms of what's happening, and you have also been on the receiving end of taking a startup to the next level during these times. So what are some of the things that you are deploying, or that you see people are deploying in the startup space in terms of survivability?
Also, for I'll give a little bit of context. So I work in a layer one protocol. And I work on a business side there. And so my job a lot of times, in addition to doing our own fundraisers, which we did 3, is to talk to all of the applications in space. And so the space today is very small still. I talked to probably like 315 applications roughly in a course of last, I don't know, like 20 months. And so my job is to actually keep track of them, making sure that not only we are moving along to migration for some of them on year, but also they're financially healthy and they have a shot at actually getting adoption. And so what's happening right now, I think that the startups I think a lot of it, first of all, depends on timing. Like if you, like, for example, like in our case, we did fundraise right before this thing collapsed. And so I think over time it will prove to be like important. Right now we don't maybe like realize this, but like actually a lot of people right now are in a lot of pain. And so I think the big difference is between projects that have a lot of employees and maybe sometimes not yet there when it comes to, let's say, releasing a game or something else. And let's say you have 20 people on the payroll, then you're actually in a world of pain. It's very, very challenging. And on the other hand, if you're like very small startup, if you like two founders somewhere like in Germany or something, and you think very scrappy about things, you can actually survive for a while. If you have a little bit of a runway, you can survive for like a year or 2. And so I think a lot of it depends on timing, as I mentioned, and also a lot of it depends on your runway, like essentially like how many people you have,
Right.
like are you hitting your goals and so forth. And so like I see across the board, there's a lot of startups that will be challenged, but I think the ones that are smaller, they're like more nimble and they'll be able to like persevere.
And there are also trends coming out, right? Like, yes, the funding has been choked up for a few segments, but for a few segments, it has been working really well. The CAC has gone to almost 0 in some cases, and there are business models, and I've been a fan of Lunch Club. I mean, they essentially started as a one-to-one interaction platform for people meeting in person, and now with whatever is happening, they've just pivoted in its entirety to like one-on-one meetings, like on Zoom or on Google Hangouts. So what are some of the trends that are emerging, and like where should people invest, and is it sustainable enough for these like startup founders to take it to, let's say, long term? If you can, maybe point out, Joel.
Oh, tough question. So I think if I had to cut it down specifically to blockchains, which is where most of my focus is, right? So I think there has been a rise in focus on the application layer at the seed stages, and anything that's at the protocol level or layer ones have to go with very large rounds, or it just becomes hard to go to market for them. But on the application layer, if you see in the last 6 months, 2 broad themes have really taken off. One is data. Partly because they can directly bring in revenue on a monthly basis. I mean, like I spend a substantial amount of money on on-chain data or market data on a monthly basis, and that basically becomes a profitable revenue model for a number of these startups that are coming to market now. The other is DeFi. This is what I've been beginning to call the money API thesis. So what that means is, if you as a startup can take a very small percentage of each transaction, let's say 0.01%, of hundreds of transactions that goes on in your product, like for instance Uniswap and Kyber have something similar to that, then over time you can be a profitable application. To give an example, Kyber has had about $1 million in fees generated through Kyber network tokens over the last year or so, and I think that's going to become a profitable model. So anywhere that includes large or highly frequent transfer of value in digital assets, or clear recurring business models, right? The other theme we are seeing now is still this whole ecosystem of content-based plays. So the blog is one. There's newsletters that are coming out. Even I write a little bit. So I think in the next 6 months we will see a more formalization of content-related startups, because I feel that's still a gap in terms of actual unbiased research that comes to the market right now. So I feel that's going to be another theme, because again, consumption of content would be on the rise. people looking to learn more about this industry would be on the rise. So that also plugs into things. So yeah, those would be the three key themes that I would say at these seed stages are going to see traction: DeFi, data, and content.
Sure. So with respect to these trends, Sasha, like how do you put growth in perspective? Because you're essentially the driver of getting these projects onboarded and looking at them in terms of taking them to the market. I mean, getting traction and so on, and that's pretty crucial for someone like you, who's building a layer 1 protocol. So how do you see the growth angle during these times with these trends?
Yeah, so I agree with Joel. Some of the digital trends actually are accelerating across the board. Not just content consumption, but a lot of things are accelerating. If you look at like streaming services, right? Or if you look at esports, or if you look at e-commerce, or if you look at DeFi, there was a bump, for example, in DeFi. Like, well, probably I'm not the best person to talk about DeFi, but I have some teams like one inch I'm close to, so like I track their data and kind of like extrapolate from there. But like I think that some of these online services are actually growing. Digital services are growing because people are staying at home. So I think that would be a trend for us. I mean, like we take a, maybe it's idealistic, but we take a long-term perspective. So we think that this industry has been through kind of like two major expansions in terms of use cases. And so the first expansion in this industry was when Ethereum was created. And so prior to Ethereum, there was essentially one use case, and there was a kind of became this use case of storing value cheaply anywhere in the world, and that's Bitcoin. And so what Ethereum did, it allowed programmability. So it allowed to apply this idea to more different kinds you can do with money, essentially, right? And that's where you saw product market fits around like lending protocols, like stable coins. There's a lot of demand for that in various places in the world. But in the end of the day, you can count use cases on your like fingers. It's like maybe 10, maybe 15, maybe it's a little bit more than that, right? But now we're going through the second phase of the kind of like second expansion of use cases, massive expansion. And the reason is because there are twofold reasons. One is transaction cost goes down dramatically. Like in our case, it's 400 times. So it's like two orders of magnitude cheaper. So what it means is you can actually enable micropayments that wasn't possible before. You can also go after people who are economically elastic. They're not like not only people who are willing to pay whatever is the transaction cost, which today is fluctuating a lot on Ethereum. And so the DeFi use cases, I think, worked out for particular kinds of people who are willing to pay a lot of money. Sometimes it's a lot of money, sometimes it's not a lot of money. Now if it's a lot cheaper, what it means if transactions are like 1 cent, or 2 cents, what it means is that all kinds of other people can actually join this industry, not just inelastic economically people. And then the second piece of this is not only transaction cost, it's also usability. So you can look at the space, right? And you can see what actually happened. You observe the space and you realize that there are like 3-4 core things that needed to happen directly on a protocol level, such as how onboarding is done, how transactions are done, how accounts are built. And so I think because of the usability improvements and because of the transaction cost going down dramatically, we'll see massive expansion in use cases. Now, the challenge that I see is that people actually don't know what's possible. And so like it's very challenging because if you think about new industries or like new kinds of explosions like this, it usually takes years for people to understand what the heck actually is happening. So if you look at the internet, when internet started, people viewed the internet as almost like a digital newspaper. Like there is this website and I come and read it, right? And then it took like another 5, 7, 10 years for people to understand, well, it's actually two-way thing. I can build like YouTube. It's user-generated content on one side. There is like advertisement-based model on the other side. It's fundamentally new medium essentially, right? And then for mobile, for example, people approach mobile early on as like, it's a mobile internet. I have a website, now I have a mobile website, right? And another time it took like another, like whatever, 5 years for people to understand this, like, well, there's a GPS here, there's a camera here. Maybe I can build something like Uber or something like Instagram, right? Like, and truly understand the new medium. Like what does it mean that like these things are possible? And so I think our challenge on our end would be explaining to people what's possible. and it will take, I think, many years. It's not going to happen overnight. But I think short term, I think people should be focusing on the use cases that already worked out, that already achieved product market fit. Like DeFi is a very strong use case, and so I think that one we'll see a lot this year growing.
Sure. I mean, for the audience, I mean, people in the audience who would not know, I mean, DeFi is essentially decentralized finance. It's the newest financial stack getting built on the blockchains. And it's like some of the people in the DeFi space call it FinTech 2.0. So just decoding that for the audience here. Yeah, I mean, like, if we go back to, let's say, building things or how things have been built in the past, and Sasha, you touched upon like different trends from like the traditional platforms that we've seen, and how people have perceived those platforms and how things have changed. And there are, again, a plethora of platforms getting built. How do you like then think of I mean, as a founder or as a startup person, how do you think of like coming up with something like this? Do you? I mean, there's like right now, if you see in this time, we have a lot of content around. We have a lot of people like Joel who write great things on like trends and what's happening in the space. But how do you substantiate that data and then think in like in your term, or re-engineer in your terms to build something of your own?
I think it's challenging. Like, there's a lot of data out there, there's a lot of content out there, but like, you know, like if everybody's producing content on the internet, I would imagine like not everyone is like Joel, right? So like there's a lot of content out there that's probably you shouldn't be spending time reading, right? So like I think it's challenging in a way, like explosion of information, like a lot of people take it like, you know, like everything, just like read it, take it for granted in terms of like what's important to read. But I think this space actually is missing education. The educational gap is like huge. It's very hard to understand the space. It's very hard to get into the space. I think only like backend engineers mainly kind of get excited about the space still. The other type of talent is missing in the space, and because it's challenging to understand it really, and understand, to your point, like possibilities of it. What is sustainable here? Like, how do I grow user base and things like that? And so I think it's very challenging overall. Like I've been trying to bring some of the like really successful like people from the web, and they've built skill set on the web for 10-20 years, and so like for them, they know the tooling, they know how to bring audience, they know how to monetize the audience, and talking to them about crypto, I think it's very, very challenging. Like for these kinds of people, like we need to wait like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years to get like real validation for them to then jump in. They're kind of like in a waiting mode. They're actually not jumping into the space. And so I think it starts kind of like with insiders who are already in the space in a way. And if they like really understand like what is possible now, I'm not sure like what's the best way to like where to find the information. I like struggle myself, but like if you have heuristics around it, like for example, like in our case, you can build things that are a lot cheaper, but it still doesn't mean that everything goes to the blockchain. Like building chat on the blockchain doesn't make any sense. It's too expensive, right? But on the other hand, maybe you can build open world in which there is a small fraction of things going on the blockchain, maybe reputational related things, social graph related things, very little amount of information going on it. And so you can have open world with a whole bunch of online events happening in this world. And whether you have access to particular events depends on maybe your reputation and social graphs and things like that. That's actually now possible, but it's not something people like actively thinking about. It's not something like it sounds like a toy. It sounds like it sounds really like weird in a way, like, you know, talking about it even. So I think it's a challenge, and things that will break out actually will look like kind of weird up front.
And then Joel, to maybe like what Sasha just said, how like does a VC then put this in perspective when there are like challenges around people who are building things already, and then pushing your boundaries in terms of like giving them checks and thinking long term and not just like 3 years or 5 years.
Right. So I think I have two ways to think about this, right? So one is I was trying to raise venture money for a remitting startup in Bitcoin in 2014, and I could see how hard it is to convince a VC to bet on something that is quite ahead of its time. And a large part of the problem is what people call herd mentality, but I think it's more of a confirmation bias thing, right? Like if you see the same thing on every source that you source your news from, you might believe this is the truth. And usually if you draw a graph, right, like by the time something's really capturing major mind share, it might not be the best time to invest in it. So that is it boils down to which role you play in VC, right? So for the last 3 years, I've been working as an analyst. So that means I do most of the core research work versus someone that's further up senior has more, important things to do, right? Like the research has to always be on the ground, in depth, really ahead of its time, because you can't feed into an investing decision like 6-7 months ahead of its time unless you go really deep. So one example is now, like DeFi is this big major thing, but actually we were discussing DeFi at Outlier Ventures in like March 2019, and I actually published a market map of the whole thing in 2019 April. It was just picking off steam. So one thing you have to do is find that balance between not being too ahead, because otherwise the startup would more or less die before it really has that product market fit. And the other is you don't want to like buy in on basis of FOMO, as we would see with many late stage investments in this space, right? So to answer your question specifically, speak to founders as often as possible, because a lot of times the pivots are the next big trend, because founders understand the space really well. Two is stay close to the industry. You can't not speak to vendors, you can't not speak to users and make a thesis on the space. You have to be on the ground if you really want to build that edge. And third is don't go too broad. So if you look at the things I look at, it's a very small slice of the whole ecosystem, which in itself is a niche, right? So the reason why you do that is because you can go to a depth that literally nobody else might do in the industry, and that gives you an edge. And that's what I've really learned in the last 2-3 years, that if you go to that kind of commitment and depth, you might have an edge that even some of the best VCs in the industry won't have, because you're closer to news, you're closer to the people building it. And yeah, I think markets pretty much depend on edge for you to be able to win.
Yeah, I think the concluding thoughts on this would be essentially the timing. The timing really matters. And a couple of weeks back, I saw this beautiful documentary on the general magic. I don't know if you all have watched that documentary. Sasha, by any chance you have? Okay, you have. Awesome. So yeah, it's basically the hidden secret project of Silicon Valley, which obviously failed, and now they're obviously showing it. But that was probably the predisposition of what you see today in computational world. Or mobile competition. So what you see in like your phones or your laptops, everything that was all there in terms of the foundational level or the structural level. And this was again in the 90s. So yeah, for those who don't know, maybe I can put the link in the show notes once we push this video on YouTube. But yeah, it's a beautiful movie for everyone to kind of watch and get inspired. But it's definitely not for the cold-hearted, because yeah, it's as much as it is inspiring, it is also depressing, because whatever credit they essentially would have gotten, they don't have that credit. So people, but yeah, amazing things did happen during that time. Perfect. So moving on, I'd like to understand from both of you, how much of the ecosystem like really matters, because it does, let's say, when you talk about regions, when you talk about startup founders like starting off like from scratch, and probably in the last 10 years things are getting better, and with remote being the thing, and at this point it's accelerating, things are probably changing. So I just want to understand, like, get the like traditional view and this view, like how, like what does ecosystem entail in this? Like we talk about Silicon Valley, we have London, which is like the fintech hub, we have Tel Aviv, and then there's Bangalore, which is like India's Silicon Valley. So how much of that matters? Joel, maybe you can start.
So I think again, I might have a unique perspective on this because I was building for Bitcoin out of India in 2014, and I saw what happened in 2017, right? So if you don't have an active ecosystem around you, you will spend a lot of time explaining things to people. You'll spend a lot of time convincing people about things, and getting them on board. For versus someone in Silicon Valley, like a founder would literally just go into a meeting and they would already know what he's talking about. So I think the ecosystem really, really matters because it determines where a founder spends his time and energy on. If you're spending all your time and energy on educating people and making people more aware about the most basic things in an industry, then it's likely that you will burn out before you can convert into revenue or onboard large numbers of users, right? So that's one way to think about it. The other is the cultural zeitgeist of an ecosystem also matters. So if you look at 2014 blockchain space and you look at it now, it's quite different. And what's happened since then is you have more people experimenting. Things like NFTs are coming of age. Things like stablecoin have come, and still there is some rift in terms of maximalism and those kind of conversations that keep happening. But I think as an industry, we've opened up to more possibilities. And I think that also matters because if everyone thinks the same way, then the industry does not really evolve and progress, right? And markets don't have enough to cut through and get an ideal winner over time. So I believe any founder that's looking to build something really needs to either have a lot of runway. So like someone like Elon Musk can go ahead and build SpaceX regardless of what the space industry is, because what he builds ends up being the ecosystem. But if you're at the early stages, you also want to be in a space where you can ride a wave, because it will really save you a lot of resources in terms of educating people and getting these conversations in place.
Perfect. Yeah, Sasha, what's your view, like coming from Silicon Valley, and yeah, how does it like matter?
In terms of how it relates to building startups in crypto, or
Yeah,
the future of Silicon Valley?
Yeah, future Silicon Valley. Yeah.
Well, so I think, people starting to work remote, for example, right now, and a lot of larger companies decided to work remote indefinitely. So I think that will change things quite a bit. What it means is that it will create competition between different companies. Like some managers no longer will be able to enforce people going to the office because people always say like, well, I can go and interview with Twitter or something. And so it will be kind of challenging. I think location is no longer matters as much because of the kind of remote trend accelerating so much versus, like otherwise it would have taken a decade. Now it's taken a couple of years. Some big, large companies decided to continue with remote after the pandemic. I think what it means is that there will be a lot more high talent availability in other places, not just in Silicon Valley. So a lot of people actually move out of Silicon Valley. I don't know exactly how much, like what's the percentage, maybe like 5%. I don't know what's the percent, but a lot of people who are like young families starting up will start realizing like, if I don't need to be here per se, then why am I paying so much money for basic things? Because Silicon Valley gotten like really unsustainable in the last 10 years. As salaries for like Facebook, Google ballooned, and other places, a lot of IPOs happened. So like I think Silicon Valley will go through transformation. It will become like a little bit less insane in terms of price points. It will be higher quality of talent available in other places. So it will be new hubs being formed, I think, which will benefit from some of the people who worked here more. But I do agree also that ecosystems for sure matter where you are, like really matters. To Joel's point on education, right? You can bang against the wall in one place and maybe you'll succeed in another place, talking about exactly the same thing. So I think location and time like really matters overall. I also I personally think a lot about social graphs and social networks. And for me, like moving out of Silicon Valley wouldn't make sense because the big part of my network is here. So the question is like, does remote change this? Maybe. But like I for some reason still value essentially social graph, and as a result the location connected to it.
Got it. Great. And one more question to like back that up, maybe Sasha again, is like, and you've been through that experience, like being like the third person at near to join. Even in your previous startups, you were like the first few people in terms of joining the startup. I mean, and we've also seen like in the crypto space itself, early whatever people who joined, let's say Coinbase, are like at this stage they're at some point like VCs. So how do you like really get through that space for someone like maybe in the audience or someone who wants to know this? How do you like identify that, okay, this is the startup that I want to work with, and these are the guys who I want to spend like my next 6 months, 12 months, whatever?
I think no, sorry, go for it.
Sorry.
Anyway, yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
I'll speak after Sasha. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So I think like trust really matters. So like whether you trust people you work with, and also the like quality, like is it like sometimes you meet people who've done it many times before, and their this decision making process is like very like trained. They've done it a lot, and they understand what's the priorities and things like that. So I think the trust and the kind of quality of like founding team like really matters when you think about like joining startup early, for example.
Okay. Yeah, Joel. Yeah, you want to add to it?
So I think it's for me it's a mix of, like I said earlier, it needs to be in the niche that I really understand well, because or else I wouldn't really be able to understand what the founder is doing properly, right? So that is one. Second is definitely like what Sasha said. There's trust, and trust comes across in different ways, right? Like one is by keeping an eye on, do they deliver on the small things that they say they will. How do they treat people within the organization and outside the organization, non-commercial relationships that they hold, because these small things compound over time. The third is it someone I would really want to work with from a cultural point of view, because a lot of times if you're in the early stages, you're almost working with the founder multiple hours a day. So you need to make sure that alignment is there. Third is, I think, a lot of times you will find founders that are exceptionally good at communicating but not really commercial. So there is that challenge. You will find people that are very good at being commercial but don't really understand the technology well. So that is a challenge. And then you find people that are really good at technology and commercial aspects, but may struggle with human skills, like just maintaining relationships. So again, I may have just given very stereotypical examples there, but you usually have to find a balance of these trifectas, or else you have struggles going forward. So I think if you look at any of the great founders, they manage this, or they get someone on board to solve for that early on. And last and most importantly is how much respect does the industry have for the person, right? Like you usually have a reputation, and if you've burned a number of people in the past, that does put up, because these things will affect you going forward. You would struggle converting customers, you will struggle in due diligence. So reputation does matter, like Sasha said.
And I think another thing to mention here in crypto, unlike other industries, it's very open. People build companies in the open. You can actually go to their Discord or Slack or Telegram or whatever it is, and actually see companies being built in real time, which is like insane.
Yeah.
And so you can spend time in like 10 Discords and talking to people in different ones and kind of like seeing what's going on for yourself before making any decisions.
So that's a good takeaway for people who want to take this decision. Yeah, Yogesh, you want to ask?
Yeah, and imagine if somebody's actually created the startup and got a dream team together and got a nice product together. Now the challenge really is how do you get the attention of the investors? So I would just like to understand how do people what would you recommend to people to go about that?
So my perspective on that is don't approach an investor right when you need a check. Build that relationship 6-7 months in advance, because that basically makes that trust barrier so much more easier. And in a lot of cases, young VCs especially, right, like people like me that don't have a decade of investing to their name, we need to like build these relationships. So what happens is if founders just approach us, it's very likely that we will actually give them insights on what will help them convert into a check down the road, or we'll give them inputs on what they're doing wrong considerably earlier, right? So there are a lot of memes on Twitter about how analysts waste time, and I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but there are also a lot of analysts that are really just trying to build their own careers, and in the process trying to help as many people. So what I would say is build relationships with people in the on the VC side early on. It does not hurt to spend an hour a week, because what that means is in most of the cases that I work with founders, we've not invested in them, but I've been able to like bring them customers, or I've been able to make an introduction to someone else that can help them, right? Or connect them to a protocol that could be giving them a grant. So all these, what do you say, this personal CRM, right? Like our Rolodex of contacts is definitely something that could help. The other is, I would say, uh, don't wait till you have a final product, right? Like what a lot of people do is they wait till they have a ready product, a ready story, customers. They make a checklist before they go to people, and then they realize that that checklist is not even what they're going to be judged on. So that's one. And then there is the flip side, is that don't waste people's time. So like a lot of time, you have to take each interaction as seriously as possible, because you want that person to get back to you the next time, right? Like everyone's giving value, and that applies to people on the VC side too, right? Like a lot of times, VCs take meetings with founders just to understand an industry, and it's happened with me. And it's the most frustrating thing, because I'm basically spending my time explaining what blockchains are to an investor, and that happens a lot in deep tech, sadly. So that is one. So respect each other's time, so that everyone don't what do you say, feel burned out. And
Yeah.
if you're really looking for discovery, right? Like what a lot of great founders do is build a community or build a content platform, because what you have then is a steady stream of your thinking over the course of your product evolving. And that becomes a go-to product for an analyst that's doing due diligence on you to understand. It can be a go-to place for a vendor to try and understand how you think and what you think, versus the 1 hour long conversation that you have when your product is finally ready and you're really trying to sell it. So that's what I say. Don't wait till the last moment.
Great. Thank you.
Awesome. No, I mean, and a lot of what Joel has mentioned, and this is something that I've experienced with like Sasha, because full disclosure, Sasha and I work together at Near Protocol. So basically, I mean, I've seen all of that happening with Near. I mean, and Sasha was obviously spearheading that. So do you want to walk us through, I mean, not the specifics, but at least the way you navigated through the getting VC attention?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is like whom you know. It's like your social network really matters. So I agree with what Joel mentioned in terms of you want to get to know people early on, because one thing is you come to people and they judge you on like kind of snapshot in time. You came to them and you're like, hey, here's what I'm doing, and they kind of judge based on that. Or another way to do it is to get to know somebody right now, and then a year later come to them and actually see the trajectory. As they see momentum, they see trajectory as opposed to snapshot in time. So I think that's very important, to be able to build those relationships at some point earlier, so then by the time you come into people, they see the progress. And so for us, like I think there was a big difference between people who saw us for the first time and people who tracked us for like a year in terms of level of interest. I think people who met us for the first time, they were like lukewarm, and then people who tracked us for like a year were like super interested. And so I think that's very important to mention. But early on, I think it's about finding within your network, is there like being resourceful, just like finding the ways to get in touch, you know. I agree, do not waste the time. A lot of times it's kind of mutual exchange. I think like if you're early on, you can get a lot of feedback up front, and so that's really valuable. Like for example, like a lot of in this space, especially given it's early and given that it's not widely accepted as the space that's kind of having a lot of traction and adoption, and therefore a lot of people not as interested. The space is kind of missing a lot of repeat entrepreneurs and things like that. And so people make a lot of mistakes, I would say. And so like if you, to the extent that you can upfront get some of the feedback on this. Like for example, you can be too early to the market. You can think that like you have this market that will really explode 5 years down the line or 3 years down the line, but it's actually not the market that will explode even in the next 20 years. So a lot of people approach this very idealistically in this industry, or they might approach decentralization as a religion, and kind of like, you just need to really it's changing and it's no longer a prevalent thing, but like that's another kind of thing. Or like regulatory constraints in which you need to operate, or are you instrumenting the right success metrics? Like what are you measuring even, right? Like for the startup. Or maybe you have a growth, but actually it doesn't relate to your core product. Like what you're saying and where the growth is coming is different. And so that happens a lot. And so like to the extent that you can upfront kind of problem solve it with people who actually can give you very critical advice upfront, to the extent that they'll provide you candid feedback, I think it's like really valuable. So I think this is like really important.
Great stuff. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. Hello. I mean, okay. Yeah, I mean, I want to talk about like the valuations in like startups. So we've seen like massive difference in valuation in terms of checks being signed, and people or startup founders essentially getting insane amount of checks. I mean, the entire like notion of, let's say, pre-seed or seed, Series A, Series B. I mean, things are like completely changing. I mean, it's getting radicalized. So Joel, I mean, how do you substantiate that when it comes to I mean, how do you put things in perspective in like numbers? Like, okay, this is the startup. Okay, I love the idea. I mean, we have zeroed down on like our terms, and this is the number we want to go ahead. So how does that, like, what's the process basically?
I think that's a little bit of art and math, right? Like I can't give you a, what do you say, clear pathway, because in different cases there's different angles that come into it. But I think uh, in a lot of cases there's the angle of social consensus. So how are other VCs willing to bid on it? Does feed into it. The other is you do your classic traditional cash flow models on it, and you take the those angles to come to a figure. The third is heavy premiums come in when, if it's a very hot sector, right? Like recently there was this Clubhouse investment that a lot of people were really talking about. And I think the reason for that is if your product has a high amount of virality in it, and if the macro environment is ideal for it to grow, then I think investors will outbid each other on it. So I think, having said all that, I think the hottest way for any startup to survive right now is revenue. And I think Covalent has more or less proven that, is that if you have good revenue, then these valuation metrics don't really matter, because you own the vast majority of your startup. You have sufficient runway to survive the rough times, and when the time comes, you can sell a large chunk of it. So I think the next 10 years would be interesting from a valuation perspective because of how the markets are right now. So the bond markets, the stage that they are in, a lot of institutional LPs pulling out of a lot of venture capital funds would also affect valuations. So what do you say? It's a mixed bag. I can't say that, hey, X plus Y is how you get to this figure. There's a lot of variables at play there.
Sure.
But one thing I'd say to every founder is, and this is something I learned in the last 3 years, is don't. Of course, you need to be smart about who you're bringing on your cap table, but don't penny pinch on things like valuation, because if you're looking for hyper growth, you might as well get the best people on board and grow faster, versus what I've seen with a number of founders in the last year is they keep arguing about 15-20% variations on the valuation, and before you know, the deal is off the table and the market stumble, and then they're in a very bad spot. Of course, things can happen the other way around too. So as founders, they need to be aware of the sentiment that the market is in, and how hot the sector is, and maybe make use of that. Right?
It's a lot of context-based, you mean to say.
There's a lot of context to it, and that's part of what makes venture capital less science and more art, you would say, right? Like the best VCs may not. I mean, they are financially savvy, no doubt about it, but they're also great at human skills and all the other non-scientific angles of things.
Great.
Yes. Perfect. So, yeah, Sasha, you want to add to what he said? Yeah.
About the sizes and valuations, or
Yeah, go ahead.
So for that, well, so I think it's really timing dependent and supply and demand dependent. So I think in this industry, it's like really strange sometimes for us. Like it's very strange because like we are layer one protocol, and we were born in the middle of 2018. And then there are other layer one protocols from 2016 and 2017. And so like, it's kind of interesting sometimes people looking at different layer one protocols as options to what to build on. And they're coming to us and saying like, well, like, like maybe you can help me bring $4 million and we'll build a game together. And I'm like, well, like this is crazy. Like this, first of all, it's perverse incentives. Like essentially our potential project building on us is asking us to pay money to build on us. So first of all, it creates misaligned incentives. Second of all, it's $4 million. Like it just sounds like insane. So like I think this industry have been like extremely volatile and very crazy when it comes to ups and downs of it, and valuations were kind of byproduct of it. And so like sometimes people think about like, oh, here's this one layer one protocol, this is this other layer one protocol, but they completely kind of forget the timeline of those protocols, and as a result, the kind of like what's going on behind it. Some people have war chests and huge amount of money and willing to kind of throw this money at building ecosystem and things like that, and some others they don't. And so like it's kind of just like very bizarre in a way. Like just being part of the industry, it sometimes is like a little bit bizarre, like seeing those differences in crypto.
Yeah, I think the 2017 ICO boom also kind of changed the outlook of investors in this space. I mean, though it's not out of the window, I mean, as an option, I mean, you still can do it, but people are not looking at it. I mean, in that perspective. And if you look at traditional startups, tech startups, you don't see like those kind of valuations, like crypto-like valuations in traditional startups these days. So that's also one trend that I've been noticing. I mean, so yeah, awesome. So Joel, I know you talked about the community stand, like in terms of like building the community, having like things that you can build in the phase where you are wanting to like go to an investor and so on. So and Kevin Kelly, obviously he came up with this 1000 true fans, which is I think is super relevant to these times as well. Like we are talking about like reaching out to customers, talking to customers. So how do you see that like shaping up, and like then with respect to the North Star metric of a particular startup, how does that change? Like from a VC perspective, how do you perceive that?
I think what's happened in the last 10 years, especially in India, is the barriers to payment have drastically reduced. So I think what Web 2.0 and like with the whole generation of startups, like Flipkart and Ola's and Uber's were, they made it common for you to be paying online for things. Now what's happening is a rise of micro entrepreneurship in the form of content. And so instead of people like building like large 10, 15-person teams, people are just launching out their own stuff and making millions of dollars doing that. So I think, what do you say, the approach to entrepreneurship and how people think about generating value out of the network is really changing. The problem is when you think about things like community, you also have to think about who is being my community member, right? Like, are you optimizing for number or revenue? So especially in India, I keep seeing this, is that a lot of people on their ad campaigns, they get tens of thousands of people viewing their things and following them and things like that, but a very few number of people actually convert into a customer. On the flip side, I've also seen businesses with barely like 100 people following them, but they have, let's say, a couple $1,000s, which is not much, but it sustains them coming in from them. So when you talk about community, you have to be crystal clear on who is the ideal community member for me. To what is the kind of value I'm deriving from them. So it can either be direct capital in the form of subscriptions, or it can be contribution in the form of codes and or marketing for you. So that is two. And you need to, like, third is you need to create an incentive for them to keep doing that. So a lot of protocols now, they have like billions of dollars, like rightfully Sasha mentioned, in their war chest. But literally, a lot of people don't have any incentive to really build on them, right? Like because your classic what people call rent seeking in economics is happening, right? People, early adopters come in, and now someone new has no reason to really build on it. So you have protocols with literally no traction, but billions of dollars maybe in the bank. So the third bit is align your incentives for your community. And fourth is, I think communities have a culture of their own. So if you look at things like 4chan, you look at Reddit, you look at any of the new age products that are coming to market, like even TikTok, they all have their own subcultures. So, and your subculture is set by the product and the leadership of the team bringing that startup to market. Be clear about what kind of culture you're creating, because that could either have a flywheel where there's more people coming in, or it could have the flip side effect where nobody else is coming in because people don't like who's associated with that product. So that's 4 things I would say around community.
Nice. Sasha, do you want to add to that in terms of community, North Star metric, and like how you guys are doing right now? Like,
yeah, I would say in crypto world, it's kind of complex. You have more constituents, you have more like it's multi-sided kind of network of people, and so there are all kinds of people. Sometimes, in the proof of work systems where miners and proof of stake systems validators, there are users, there are full nodes, there are core developers, there are exchanges, there are foundations, there are contributors, and so I think you need to design incentives for each one and be able to build something that actually essentially that community owns in a way, right? That's kind of the ethos of the space. 2017, what we saw is that there was a lot of interest in more deeper economical participation of the community. That like in my mind, that what 2017 was. And so now it's about understanding how to actually productize it, how to make it more like sustainable. And so I think it's all about building the incentive systems, like the right governance process, to get everyone involved and everyone excited to contribute. So I think it's a moving target. It's like work in progress. We'll see a lot of experimentation happening if we're talking about crypto specifically.
Sure. So we can say probably this is a mix of community-led growth plus product-led growth, right? I mean, in that sense.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Good point. And so, like, actually, there's a little bit of a challenge sometimes for people to come into the industry and kind of thinking about the kind of product-led growth alone, when there's also this community piece that's central to what you're doing. So it's like a big mindset change, I would say.
Yeah. Perfect. Great. So we do have some time. I think it's like. And we still have a few attendees. Maybe you guys can ask questions. Maybe this is the right time for us to take questions. Unless Yogesh, you want to ask anything specific.
So nothing specific as such. I think we've spoken about a lot of different things today. So I've gained quite a good perspective from this discussion. So. We'll just wait for the audience questions. So nothing different from me, really.
Okay, if not, I mean, I have a question to both of you. In terms of like making things work, in this thing, you talk about like what's happening right now. We talked about the stuff that's happening. I mean, there's a lot of negativity. There's a lot of we're talking about survivability as well. So like, how much of a startup should be like prepared? I mean, these times, like regardless of these times. So basically, I want to know what is that survival kit that a startup needs to have? Because I mean, the stats are insane. Like for anyone who wants to get into this world, like there are the chances of you being successful is somewhere around like 5 to 10%. 90% of startups fail. So, and given these times, I mean, and this is actually accelerating. So what's your survival kit in that case?
Yeah, I would say like
sorry, go ahead.
Focus on adoption. That's very important, right? Focus on revenue, focus on adoption, sustainability, focus on your cash burn. So that's as it relates to survivability. What's different this year? So like descoping everything you build. Instead of building decentralized, prediction market, focus on building maybe the centralized one, and then focus on getting users and getting maybe revenue, and then decentralize over time, like as an example. But I think another important piece is that startups and how they get to product market fit, it doesn't change, right? So I think the formula is still the same. So you need to time box your assumptions. You need to create assumption about who's your market and what does your market, who's your user in the market, and what does this particular person have a problem in, right? And then for next maybe a month or whatever is your time box period, 2 months could be, you just talk to a whole bunch of people and try to validate or invalidate your assumptions. And so then you move on. If it was wrong assumption, you move on. You need to be flexible to actually move on to other assumptions. So I think that how do you get to product market fit? It doesn't change in a way, but because of also the way this year kind of where it is, you need to de-scope, you need to focus on adoption, you need to focus on revenue.
Yeah, you want to go ahead, Joe? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what Sasha mentioned is exactly accurate. So you want to cut down on burn. You don't want to do any unnecessary expense. You want to be careful of who you get on board. But I think just translating Sasha's words into VC terms, right? Bring in revenue. That's the best thing that you can do, or you should have measurable metrics, because I think a lot of times it's not a lack of capital that kills startups. There's always capital chasing startups if you have metrics that are growing, right? So if you have the numbers in place, there is capital. The world has an abundance of idle capital searching for yield. It will come for you, unless of course you're building something very exotic and esoteric and people are not really able to get their minds around it. So that also happens. But I think focus on revenue definitely. And third is what I'm seeing in the space is people are planning for 18 to 24 months from now. So even startups that did $1 million raise in the last 6 months are extending their raise now and actually diluting a little more to raise another $500,000 to $600,000 in the early stages now. So let's say call that a pre-Series A stage, where they're trying to build enough runway for the next 18 months. So that is again a number from India. That number would likely vary depending on your geolocation, but 18 months at the least is what people are looking for to get out of the COVID situation right now.
Yep. A last question from my side. How do you compare 08, 09 to what's happening right now? And from an opportunistic standpoint, because we saw Airbnb, Stripe coming out of those times. And yeah, so comparison wise, how do you translate that?
Sasha, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think that it's more challenging time this time than 2008. 2008 was, there's a lot of bailouts that happened, and it was mainly around bankers being bailed out. This time, in addition to this, there'll be a lot of small businesses going out of business, right? So for example, in US to date, there are 40 million people submitting unemployment benefits since the beginning of this situation. I know a lot of people who lost their jobs. So I think it will be a lot of challenges ahead, and they're not quite priced in the market or anything like this. It will be a lot of pain, I think, on behalf of people.
From my perspective, to be fair, I was still in school, so whatever I say right now is anecdotal, right? So I think the key difference this time is that the global startup ecosystem is fundamentally different. In 08, 07, places like Israel and a lot of Asia was still playing catch up. Now you have regional sources of capital that would directly compete and invest directly in their regional startups now. So that makes a little bit of a difference. Second is, I feel like what Sasha mentioned, right? The metrics look far worse, but the markets have a completely different view of their own, right? Like the S&P 500 is almost where it was in March 12th. And that makes no sense in light of the unemployment and things that we are seeing. And a lot of it has to do with government stimulus, but I feel the pain would catch up. But I think the story is the same. This is when the best startups would be built, be it like Google and Amazon and the likes in the early 2000s, or the Ubers and Facebook's coming of age in the last recession. I think this is the best time to be on the ground, building alongside teams and being with smart people around you, because if you do, then there's two upsides to it. One is mentally you can survive the bad situation we are all in, and two is we will all get out of this stronger than we are. I mean, in every sense of that word, right? Like economically and from a growth point of view. So what I would say to every founder is be picky of who you spend time with. Even for young VCs, right? Like you got to be picky of which founder you spend the most time with, because that determines how the next 3-4 years would go for you. And this may be the opportunity of a lifetime for many people. If we do think that the same story would repeat.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, I totally agree. Perfect. So I don't see any questions here, but I mean, from my side, I can just go on. There's definitely a lot to talk about, and Joel and Sasha can also stretch. That's that's totally fine, and I know of that. But yeah, I mean, this was definitely awesome. Sasha, where can people find you? Joel, if you can share that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually tend to I don't spend too much time like on social networks, and I just like work most of the time. But I do have Twitter, for example. It's at Aliaksandr X, and yeah, I used to write a little bit more, not anymore. But I'll soon have a podcast, so that will be probably good place to find me. It will be good conversations. It will be called Building the Open Web.
Awesome.
On my side, I think the best way to reach me is on Twitter. Just drop me a DM. I make sure I treat it like email more or less. So I get back to everyone. I do a little bit of writing on this blog called decentralized.co. I will post the link here for everyone. It's primarily blockchain stuff. Hopefully in the next 6 months I can go into broader fintech, but that's what I write there. Yeah.
Awesome. Yogesh, you want to conclude? Yeah.
I mean, I quite like. I picked up that thing. I treat Twitter like my email. So anybody who wants to catch attention of the VCs, you know what to do. Read them.
Yeah, because you have a lot of social context, right? You can just go to their profile and you know what they do. You know how they interact with others. So if it's a very toxic person, I just don't reply. Usually that also happens.
Of course.
But I really like that social context when it comes to Twitter. So yeah.
Productive conversations.
Yes.
Super.
Yeah. Do you want to conclude, or yeah? I mean, how?
I mean, I just say, for somebody who actually comes not from the startup space, and for me, this entire bit about startup as well as the VCs is quite new. So it was a great initiation. So thank you, Sasha, and thank you, Joel, also for sharing your views and being so transparent and kind of presenting all of years of your experience to everyone who was on the call. I know I've kind of taken a lot of insight from this discussion, so I can only say thank you for bringing this on the table.
Perfect. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Joel. Thanks, Sasha.
Thanks, guys.